It is time to stop saying that AEW pays off the wrestling journalists. Here's what I mean by that. I truly believe there is a relationship between AEW and wrestling journalists. And I don't just mean Dave Meltzer. I mean essentially all of them. I mean Matman, I mean WrestleNomics, I mean Fightful, WrestleZone, even the smaller independent ones like John Alba. I believe there is a relationship between them and AEW, but I do not believe it is necessarily financial. What I do believe is that part of it is emotional and part of it is quid pro quo. Now, here's the emotional part. I've said on this channel a couple of times that before PW Insider lost their mind, Dave Shearer, I believe it was, or was it Mike Johnson? It was one of the two, but I'm pretty sure it was Dave Shearer, was asked a question in a Q&A segment about why wrestling journalists were discussing AEW so favorably. And his response was that they view wrestling the same way as Tony Khan, that AEW represents wrestling as they want it. And therefore, in order to not be wrong, they are emotionally invested in AEW's success. In other words, if AEW fails, then all of the wrestling journalists who have been talking about this is what wrestling should be for the last 20 years will once again be proven wrong. And especially Meltzer. But since that's not what they want, especially when it comes to the certain kinds of wrestlers that are on top. For instance, you think that Dave Meltzer, who spent 5 or 6 years touting how Kenny Omega is one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, you think he's going to take all that back if AEW goes under? No. You think he wants to have to eat those words about how great Kenny Omega was, how he spent all that time comparing Kenny Omega to everybody who's ever been on top in WWE? You think he wants to walk around with that egg on his face? No, he doesn't want to. So of course he's going to, if for nothing but his own ego, going to say anything Kenny Omega does is great. Every match is great. He's really great. He's awesome. He's fantastic. Everything is going to be great. Because if he says it's not, then he's going to have to admit that he was wrong. If the company starts to fail, starts to flounder, starts to plummet under the watches of Kenny Omega as the champion, then he's going to have to admit that he was wrong about Kenny Omega the whole time. Because at the first chance of actually proving that Kenny Omega was a star in the United States, it floundered. This is exactly what happened, however. Kenny Omega has not done very well as the top champion in AEW. Now, he did pop some buy rates, but that was mostly due to the booking of things around him. For instance, the barbed wire steel cage thing. And him being the biggest star on Impact, which is like being, a golden nugget in a box of charcoal. That kind of thing, it does stand out. But when you look at, how much they put him in the Hall of Fame, and these are pro wrestling journalists who voted Kenny Omega in the the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame, and when he was only like 34 or 35 years old, and they put him in the Hall of Fame. Do you think that all of a sudden, all these guys who say that Kenny Omega is one of the greatest wrestlers in the world and he's not even 40 years old, all of a sudden they want to prove themselves wrong by dissing AEW and saying that what they're doing is stupid? No. They have egos that are tied into this. Their emotions are tied into this. No, absolutely not. They're not going to say anything negative about Kenny Omega. Not until, he does something that they can't cover up. Right? There's a lot of behaviors that they do. The cross-dressing, the fingers in the butt, all that kind of stuff that, they refuse to say anything about, But here's the biggest issue that I believe is the reason why you get so much favorable coverage towards AEW. I believe a lot of it has to do with access. The WWF and a lot of other wrestling promotions, not many give the wrestling journalists access. And what I mean by that is constant praise, this guy, Tony Khan, is talking about, oh, I read the dirt sheets. I was a big fan of The Observer. Oh, yes, and he consults with Meltzer and all this kind of stuff. He talks to Meltzer all the time. Oh, I talk to Tony all the time. Like, who runs a company and sits around talking about the company or the booking decisions or anything with a wrestling journalist who has never ran a company? Like, it seems a little weird to me, right? Now, I can understand, like, when I read books, and I read a lot of books about wrestling, and you see that companies are getting into some financial trouble. They don't, or they trying to figure out the finish to a story or something like that. They want to figure out how to end this match in a way that doesn't bury both guys. They don't turn to wrestling journalists to do it. They turn to the old guard. You will see in these books, they'll often turn to Jerry Jarrett or J.J. Dillon, or they'll call Pat Patterson, they'll call Dusty Rhodes, or they'll call somebody like that in order to get ideas about how to end this match, how to end this feud, how to take this thing to the next level. But when you talk to Tony Khan, when you listen to Tony Khan, it's almost always journalists. Like, who on his roster really can he turn to? I watch AEW. I see no influence of Arn Anderson or Dean Malenko or Jerry Lynn or anybody else that he called. I just see this is what wrestling journalists would like. And then I turn around and I see this is what they like. And then you turn around and you see this too. You will see a lot of freebies for wrestling journalists. Like the Jericho boat cruise that everybody got to hang out on, that they probably didn't pay for, right? They got free access to that. They have these media scrums where they go down, they talk to the media, and they talk to these wrestling journalists as if they're legitimate media, And if these people criticize AEW, they don't get that access. They get attacked. Now, I personally don't like Ringside News, but Ringside News has not been shy, and it's pretty much the biggest platform that I've seen so far that has not been shy about critiquing AEW, and sometimes even in brutal ways. While most other, especially some of the older guard, like the PW Torch or the Observer or PW Insider, they will criticize AEW, but they'll criticize it as if it has kid gloves on it. Oh, it's only 2 years. They'll learn, and you'll be like, wait a minute, you keep proclaiming it's the best wrestling show on TV. It's the #1 wrestling show amongst the 18 to 49 male demographic on Friday nights and Wednesday afternoons or whatever the hell. And you don't treat it like that. You treat it like it's a show that's been on for a year. It's been on for almost 3 years, right? They signed all of these top guys and the ratings are going backwards. And yet you do not see wrestling journalists talk about it. They'll say, oh, Dynamite's ratings are down, but the demo is strong. They'll always put a positive spin on it. They love putting a positive spin on it because if AEW fails, then they were wrong, right? They were wrong all these years of John Cena sucks, but John Cena sells a bunch of t-shirts, so they can't really, how do you argue with success? Wrestling journalists somehow find a way to do it. And I know that that's the kind of a thing that critics do anyway. When something is being successful, they find a way to take cheap shots at it. Like, you can go back and look at Siskel and Ebert. They couldn't possibly understand why anybody went to see Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. The guy wasn't a great actor. He was stilted. His English was kind of he really only had 1 or 2 roles that he ever played that he played interchangeably, and they didn't like him because he wasn't Al Pacino. They didn't get Arnold Schwarzenegger. Wrestling journalists, they don't get WWE, but they get AEW. And even when AEW does things that are absolutely silly, and that if it had taken place on Raw, they would just eat it alive and complain and say that it was awful and say that it was terrible and it was the worst thing to happen in the history of this sport and all this kind of stuff. If the commentary was as bad as Jericho is, you never hear wrestling journalists complain about how bad Chris Jericho is on commentary. They never say anything. But WWE had a guy on commentary. He was on commentary 1 week, and they was talking about how awful he was. Jericho has been on Rampage screaming and yelling 3 or 4 times. They have not said a thing. Nobody's ever said Jericho is awful on commentary. He needs to go away. Nothing. All these people who almost kill themselves in the ring, doing botched moves, all this kind of stuff. Imagine it, like when that stuff happened on NXT, they was pointing it out. When Ty Conti and I forget who it was she was wrestling was having a really bad match on NXT, people were like, hey, this stuff should still be on the network. It's not TV ready, yada, yada, yada. But when it happens on AEW and the AEW Botches account is talking about it, that's so unprofessional. How can you do that? Why are you making fun of these guys? They're out there trying their best. There's always a positive spin that they put on it. And I think a lot of it is ego and a lot of it is quid pro quo. If you criticize AEW, you don't get that access. Which means you don't get to ask questions to CM Punk or Bryan Danielson because they're not going to talk to you. WWE rarely does any interviews with these people. When was the last time, I think, what was it? I can't remember the last time WWE did an interview with any wrestling journalist like the Wrestling Observer newsletter or anything like that. But you constantly see this with AEW, which is why their fan base is the way that it is. In terms of their fan base consists of people who follow wrestling journalism. That's it. People who exist outside of the wrestling bubble, very few of them actually watch AEW, and they don't watch it consistently. And you can tell by looking in the audience and by the whole mantra of, what's that they say about WWE? They insult your intelligence, which wrestling in general insults your intelligence, which is why, advertisers and most people who continuously go with the refrain, it's fake, right? That comes from people who are like, you must think it's real in order to watch it. It's like, no, I know it's not. But wrestling journalists will constantly say WWE insults your intelligence while being a PG product and that kind of stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. WWE is not perfect, but it doesn't have to be, and it cannot be. Nothing can be. But AEW is far more flawed than most people are willing to give it credit for. And I watched wrestling journalists say that there was going to be episodes of Dynamite, that was going to get massive ratings. Oh, it was going to get 1.8 million people. It's going to be a massacre. Isn't that what Brian Alvarez said? It's going to be a massacre in the demos. It's going to be this, that, and the third. And then it comes out and it's not. And none of them say, whoops, my bad. Or, damn, that was disappointing. They just say, strong number from AEW. It's consistent with what they've been doing over the last couple of, it's bullshit. It's literally bullshit. I watched that Brandon Thurston guy. I watched a clip that he posted online, or somebody posted online, of him, mocking the fact that AEW is trying to do too much on television and completely destroying their own ratings. Because the highest rated segment that I've ever seen from AEW was just Bryan Danielson in the ring talking. It got like 1.5 million people on, like, if I was to follow the ratings. And I did see the ratings for that segment because the show got 1.3 million viewers. Bryan Danielson's segment, just him showing up on Dynamite, got 1.5 million people to watch that segment. Where did those people go? And you would think that a wrestling journalist would ask that question. You would think people who call themselves observers and analysts and people who talk about demos as if they know what they're talking about, if they talk about advertisers as if they know what they're talking about, you would keep asking that question. Where did the 1.1 million people who tuned in to see CM Punk, where did they go? Where did the 1.5 million people who went to see Bryan Danielson, where did those people go? If when SmackDown did 4 million viewers and then didn't do 4 million viewers the next week, people were instantly like, where did those people go? Where did they go? They saw SmackDown, saw it was a bad show, and didn't come back to watch it. That same logic should apply when they talk about AEW, yet it does not. Now, you can say, look, I can't tell you what to say, but I can say this. I will not be saying that AEW is, on the payroll, or these guys are on the payroll. I don't believe that there's constantly checks flowing in and out. But I do believe that they know better, that if they criticize Tony Khan, They will not get these conversations with CM Punk. They will not get quotes from Daniel Bryan. They will not get quotes from Adam Cole. They will be shut out. Nobody will talk to them, and nobody will be interested in them if they started to tell the truth. That's my opinion. My opinion is not that the check's in the mail. If I've ever said that, I'll take it back right now. I believe it's 100% ego, that these guys just like the performers that are involved. And here's another thing that I really just didn't think of until just now. But think about how many of these people are wannabe wrestlers themselves, or want to be in the wrestling business themselves. You got guys like Justin LaBar, you got guys like John Alba who are wrestling on cards, and they're like, oh, this is my friend. My friend. You got John Alba constantly talking about how great Daniel Garcia is. That's his friend. I put people on him. I've seen Justin LaBar talk about how he was friends with some of these guys from different small independent shows. I want to see them do well because they're all my friends. And then that also factors in to why AEW gets so much credit. Because guys are friends with these journalists. That's another thing. But that's part of the ego argument. You know? I can't criticize my friends. You would think that it would be a conflict of interest if you were to say, how can you, Brian Alvarez, who has supposedly a wrestler, how can you have wrestled some of these people and openly say that you were friends with some of these people? How can then we trust anything that you say positive about them? Because you have already said, oh, these guys are my friends. We know that you're not friends with Vince McMahon. Because he's not going to, oh, Vince used to call me all the time. Yeah, 30 years ago. Back when people used to argue in the sheets. Now Vince doesn't need to talk to Meltzer. So why talk to Meltzer? Doesn't need to talk to Wade Keller anymore. And yes, I do know that they used to talk to them. They don't talk to them anymore. That's why they turned on him so much. You won't give me access, I'll attack you. I will bitch at you. I will complain at you until you give me access. You have to give me something. Give me a press release. Give me something. Or we're going to turn the media against you. And they do it all the time. And here's another thing that I found to be very bizarre. It's almost in lockstep. You almost never see anybody separate from the pack. How many wrestling journalist websites will disagree about a story or a subject and openly do so? The best that they'll do is, we were not able to confirm, right? Like, which is bizarre. Like somebody puts out a story, and then they'll say, well, we were not able to confirm that. Instead of saying that didn't happen, we don't know why they would say that, or whatever the case may be. They'll quibble over little things. Oh, you guys are using our articles and not giving us credit for it and all that kind of shit. But when it comes to being massively wrong, when it comes to about, bad at analytics, different stuff, they don't call each other out. They don't. Like there was a narrative in, I think, June of 2020, or actually it was probably later 2020. When the argument was coming out that AEW is going to be bringing fans back into the arena. And we saw that there were fans in the arena at some pay-per-view before that, right? When they went backstage and there was kids there and there was all kind of stuff. It was like, wait a minute. They got fans there. And they kept saying, oh, well, AEW's ratings are down because there are no fans. It's like, but there are fans. And those are just family and friends. What? Backstage, not backstage, but at the concession stands, they had people in the crowd long before WWE did. But the wrestling journalists kept it quiet. They didn't talk about it. Just like when NXT had these the COVID issues. Oh, NXT got all these COVID issues. When AEW had COVID issues, it was very, very, very quiet. Just like I hate to put it this way, just like the Brody Lee thing. There's no doubt in my mind people knew about that stuff. And they just didn't talk about it. They didn't mention it at all. Because they probably asked not to. But I'm cool with that because, that was a serious health issue. But all these people who are popping up with COVID in WWE, it was front page everywhere. WWE has COVID issues. They need to be shut down, yada, yada, yada. AEW runs a sloppy shop. And Brody Lee died. The only person to die during the pandemic was an AEW wrestler. And that was very, very quiet. That came out of nowhere. After they kept on, somebody's going to die on the NXT roster. No, somebody died on the AEW roster. But they were like, oh, well. And I know, Brody Lee's death didn't have anything to do with COVID. That's what they told me. I believe his wife. I'll say that. I just find it very suspicious that one is what people were running with. Anytime anyone in NXT had COVID, when Ricochet and Casey Catanzaro went out to dinner, it was a big deal. It was a big hubbub. How dare they go to a restaurant without wearing a mask? How dare they? When Jericho was going on tour and all that kind of stuff, the only people who were talking about it were the people who were calling the wrestling journalists hypocrites. And then, of course, he came out as a Trump supporter. Then it was okay to attack him, right? It was all right to attack him then once they found out he was a Trump supporter. But I'm just looking at things, man. I say it's time to stop saying that they accept money, because they use that a lot. They'll say, "Oh, I didn't get my AEW check this week." It's like, oh, no. What you did, however, was you put in on putting your friends over. You talk about how great the wrestling is, or how great this angle is, or you see often, like if you watch Twitter during Dynamite, you will see these little side swipes that they do at WWE. Oh, AEW does, it feels so good to start a wrestling show with a wrestling match. Like, how about that? Like, wow, they're doing something else so different, so unique. It's like, what? WWE has a formula and AEW doesn't. It's like these kinds of things I have noticed over the last 2 or 3 years of watching AEW. And I have noticed that wrestling journalists maybe are not accepting cash, but they are accepting clout. They are accepting clicks. They are accepting trips on Jericho's cruise. They are accepting free seats in the arena, which I'm almost guaranteeing you they get free seats. This kind of stuff. And in return, they talk very, very glowingly about Tony Khan. And that's why I believe, and you know what? Here's another weird thing. When it comes to all this major media, very few of it, and Barstool is part of that too, because remember, Barstool was on an episode of Dynamite, the guy who runs the wrestling account on Barstool. He was on Dynamite before. And so now, he starts doing YouTube videos again. And he's talking about, and it's all AEW guys. MJF, Tony Khan, CM Punk. I think, Sasha Banks has been on there before. But you started seeing, like, they started making a lot of their more controversial comments to big up Barstool. Barstool is a huge sports account. They're trying to increase their visibility. But Barstool is one of those things that are kind of, I wouldn't say they're in the tank, but they're trying to be courted by AEW. The Forbes articles, how many of those guys are really just wrestling involved? Or are they just involved in this interesting thing Tony Khan, the billionaire, is doing? The Variety articles. That guy's a fan. The guy who keeps writing the Variety articles, that Gavin Bridge dude, he's a fan. He's not some disinterested third party who just shows up and is like analyzing the show and is, oh, hey, this is what I found during my analytics. No, he's an actual fan. He's a fanboy. And these kinds of things, it's hard to tell who's a wrestling fan these days, because despite the fact that advertisers seem to think wrestling fans are low IQ, backwards hillbillies, they range amongst movie stars and athletes and all kinds of stuff. So these people pop up all over the place, and they have agendas. The guys who keep asking AEW about AEW at the WWE conference calls. Like, these guys have to be fanboys. Why else would you be bringing that up during the time when you're supposed to be talking about maximizing profits and maximizing revenues or cutting expenditures, business stuff? And they're like, oh, well, what do you think about AEW and yada, yada, yada? It's like, now is not the time or place for that. But it's the only time you get Vince McMahon on the phone, because you can't get him on the phone any other time. He's not going to make any other public statements about AEW. So now was the only time they got to do it. And all they need is one guy in a good position who is somebody who subscribes to the Observer or some of these other websites, and he gets to ask that question to Vince. And perfectly fine. There's not an issue there, but it all just is supposed to get AEW's name out there, and I see that a lot with the fans. Oh, all Roman Reigns did was promote AEW by talking about AEW. It's like, well, okay, so all of these guys who talk about WWE all day, I guess that's free promotion. Nobody ever says that. All Roman Reigns ever did when he talked about AEW was promote AEW. He shouldn't even be talking about them. But Tony Khan is sitting here talking about Raw. He spent a week talking about WWE. He talks about WWE in every single interview that he does. He doesn't say, look, I don't want to discuss them. We're not interested in them. We want to focus on our show. When they did the Grand Slam media stuff, almost every article I read, it was Tony Khan saying something negative about WWE and about how they're changing wrestling and they're revolutionizing the sport. And the other person did not argue at all and say, well, I'm looking at, what are your revenues and expenditures? You're a private company. How much money did you make last year? How much money did you lose last year? How much money did you lose over the pandemic? We know how much money WWE lost over the pandemic, because we know what revenue streams completely dried up. And you have to guess when it comes to AEW because nobody asks those questions. Nobody asks the question, how much money did AEW spend within the last year? What were their costs for the last year? What are the salaries for any of these wrestlers? Nobody is saying anything. If anything, what they're saying is, and I never forget this, Jonathan Snowden, wrestling journalist, AEW isn't overspending for wrestlers. They're getting wrestlers because they like work-life balance and what was that? Good creative freedom and work-life balance. You're like, what? Like that sounds like an AEW press release. That doesn't even make sense. But then you also see a problem when it's something that is pretty obvious, like Adam Cole going to AEW, right? Weeks before they did it, when the whispers were out there, I was like, okay, Adam Cole's girlfriend works there. And all of his friends are there. Of course he would go to AEW. And they kept searching through the mystical reasons why Adam Cole would leave. He was so upset by bad creative. They wanted him to be a manager. They wanted him to cut his hair. They wanted him to change his name. It's like his friends work in AEW. His girlfriend works there. Duh. What more analyst? You don't have to find a needle in a haystack on this one. This is one you don't have to overthink. This one was pretty goddamn obvious. But they overthought it. It had to be something negative against WWE first. Before it was, oh, well, his friends work in AEW. Which is, intuitive. The first thing you would think of. And that's why I say all the ROH guys that are in WWE, a lot of them are going to jump ship. Soon as Adam Cole, I was like, okay. And I started hearing about Kevin Owens. And I was like, oh, yeah, they were friends too. Of course. Why wouldn't they? They were buddies. It was just like when Hall and Nash went to WCW and then all of a sudden Sean Waltman shows up. It's like, are you surprised? They got their friend a job. AEW's been doing this for over a year. It's just been, call my friend on the phone. Hey, come on in. The water's nice. You don't need to overthink that. Yet they are overthinking it. And they're overthinking it for a reason because they want you to be confused about why this stuff is happening. They want you to think that it's a rejection of WWE because they wanted him to be a manager and they wanted to change his name and cut his hair and make them work 205 live. It's like they're just making shit up because you would believe it. But in all honesty, it was far more simple than that. So if you look at everything that has been going around AEW and the wrestling journalists, it's been a crazy incestuous relationship. And it's been very, very harmful to the wrestling business. Because it not only has, is it almost constantly negative stuff about WWE. And I'm okay with it when it's negative and it deserves to be. But when they turn, something that's a positive into a negative, I'm kind of like, wait a minute, But when AEW, they turn negatives into positives. They did a horrific number for the Saturday Night Dynamite. Who talked about it? Who talked about how bad that number was? Nobody. I looked it up. I had to look it up myself because I didn't see any wrestling journalists talk about how bad that Saturday Night Dynamite was. Nobody talked about how bad it was. But SmackDown did bad because it was on it was on the same night that it's usually on, but it's on a completely different network with a lower reach than their normal network. And people talked about how horrible it is. Look at the ratings. Raw is up against Major League Baseball and the NFL. Raw's ratings are down. And it's like, it's okay to say that things were abnormal this week. Oh, ratings went down because, there's a war in Afghanistan and more people watch the news, which is what it was last year. COVID was a thing. People were watching the news. News did big business. Sports is another one. If it's an MLB game or hockey or something like that, that's going to eat especially into the demos. It's okay to make that excuse. That's a normal excuse that would play out regardless of what wrestling show is on. It could be AEW, it could be Impact. It's going to have the same reaction, But they don't do that for WWE. This past episode of Raw, which took place on October the 18th, I believe, was up against not only Monday Night Football, but Major League Baseball too, I believe. So it got a really terrible number. How many people mentioned that baseball and football was on at the same time? Nobody. I didn't see anybody. But you go and look at the ratings yourself. You see, damn, football was on and basketball was on. Okay, the football hit is it's football season. I didn't even know it was football. I didn't even know baseball was on. So I was like, okay, this kind of stuff, when it's bad analytics, is why I started my own YouTube channel. Because I started looking into this stuff myself. There is an incestuous relationship between the AEW and the wrestling journalists. And a lot of it is anti-WWE bias, which some of it is. Some people aren't just pro AEW. They're anti-WWE, which is all perfectly fine and dandy. But I'm going to catch you. Because if I keep, and I shouldn't have to, but the thing is, I don't have the reach that everybody else does. I don't have 100,000 followers or whatever the hell, what culture and all these other sites. So nobody's going to pay attention to the things that I think that I'm saying. Brian Alvarez did a piece when he was talking about SmackDown picked a fight with Dynamite and lost. I'm like, they picked a fight with Dynamite? How do you even know that was SmackDown's idea to go 2 hours and 30 minutes? How do you know that was a WWE call? How do you know that wasn't Fox? No, nobody thought about that. Nobody asked that question. Nobody said, hey, Fox Sports 1 probably asked for another 30 minutes. Maybe they even got paid for it and didn't care what the numbers were because they got paid for it anyway. Likelihood, could have asked, didn't get asked at all. Nobody said, well, Fox Sports 1 shouldn't have made that call. It was a bad call from them or whatever the case may be. Nobody also did anything in having this analytics. And my point in all this, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, is you see how these things are covered. Everybody sees the bias. That's the easy part. The hard part is trying to figure out why. And I think the biggest issue is people keep thinking it's money. I don't think it's money. I think it's ego. I think it's access. And I think it's relationships within AEW. They just don't want to talk bad about their friends. It's easy to talk bad about people you don't know. All right? It's hard to talk bad about people you do know. It's hard to admit that you might have been wrong about a wrestler you spent almost 10 years saying was the greatest of all time. Like, I love how Chris Jericho became the greatest wrestler of all time when he jumped ship and went to AEW. He was all of a sudden, oh, Chris Jericho's the greatest wrestler of all time. It's like, what? You know, these kinds of things I notice. I pay attention. You know, I don't got the best memory, but I have a good one. You know, so it's time to stop saying that AEW is on guys are on the payroll. It's hard to start saying, when will they criticize AEW? And what will be the consequences for them doing so? It's time to start asking that question. It's time to start posing that question to guys. Why don't you ever criticize AEW in a way that you criticize WWE? Because you know what's going to happen. Tony Khan's going to see it on Twitter because he's on Twitter all the time. He's going to see it. And he might embarrass you by responding, right? Vince is not going to respond. He doesn't care that you exist. But Tony Khan might respond. And if you get pissy with Tony, what's going to end up happening? You won't get your conversation with CM Punk. You won't get that exclusive. It's just like Washington, D.C., man. All those people kiss the Democrats and the Republicans' asses because they want access. They go to these dinners and all this kind of stuff because they want access. It's the exact same thing with AEW. WWE is not trying to give these guys any type of free anything. You know, they might give them a press pass or something like that. They might let them do interviews, maybe. But WWE is very controlling about who does interviews with their wrestlers and that kind of stuff. Kind of questions are asked and that kind of stuff. These kinds of relationships don't exist in AEW. You're incentivized. Tony Khan will send you to a guy because he's a friend. He's a good pal. He's a buddy of mine. It's not a negative thing. It's all nepotism, which is, wrestling business is built on nepotism. But it's something that I noticed. So I think it's time to stop saying that people are taking checks from AEW. I think it's time to stop doing that.